Hello everyone, this is going to be a slightly different video, but I felt like I was having some real blocks, so I just wanted to get this one out and see how it goes, and hopefully I'll get back to some of my more regular schedule. I've been a little busy preparing for Intercontinentals and then off the grid, and also my wedding, which is kind of soon, but I am hoping to get back to a more regular schedule. So enough about me whining, on today's topic, which is about Corp win conditions. I have them as one word here and two words throughout the rest. But basically, this was me starting to think about, oh, what is a corporate win condition? Why do I have a definition in my head that's different from many other people's definitions, and why is it sort of difficult for anyone to land on a single unified win condition? So I just want to start by kind of thinking about how did I start thinking about this once I decided this was a video topic. And I was like, well, what sort of traditional ways people think about win conditions? So Magic the Gathering is, the big boy in the space. It's not the only one that's like this, but it's a set of card games. And I should say, I think I stole this definition from Pinsel, and I also owe a lot of thanks to Lost Geek and Simply the Onion. And then everyone else in Itinerant Protesters who joined in, we had a nice little discussion about this topic about a week ago that helped me narrow down some ideas here. But it's a set of cards that sort of win the game unless your opponent has some way to interfere with any one of those effects. And the MTG cards I have on the bottom literally is for me Googling MTG combo win. I've do, it, no, I don't play enough MTG to know if this is a real thing. But I think one thing is that Netrunner often feels a little bit different from a lot of the classic sort of MTG style games, and can feel more like a sort of Euro style board game, in that instead of winning on the spot, even though there is a binary point where you win, it's often more of this resource accumulation grind. And so over time, you're converting um, in many Euro games, actions and resources and cards into victory points with a higher efficiency. So in Dominion, the example on the right, you have three different cards that you can put in your deck. They cost more, but they give you more victory points for a single card, and the winner is usually the person who can put the most provinces in their deck to a first order. So a win condition is one of those things where, like, in Magic, I think it can be well defined in some decks. It can be, there are I've played a tiny bit, and there are some decks where it's like my goal is just to stall out the board until I can get this giant creature down, and it's unable to be interacted with in a lot of ways, and it will eventually, over the course of 2-3 turns, deal 20 damage to my opponent's face. Or maybe I just have a card that says, if I reach this state, I win the game. Um, and that's not something we see often in Netrunner. It's something we do see on occasion, but not too often. Many more Netrunner games are about, okay, when can I start buying up provinces, or when can I start getting accesses and victory points or scoring agendas? Um, and so that's sort of more the route I'm going to take when I talk about win conditions throughout the rest of this video. But one of the things I was thinking about is I was distinguishing cards between win conditions and value cards. And value is one of those terms that I've been using a lot, but haven't defined, and I don't know that I have a single unitary definition for it, just like I don't have a single unitary definition for a win condition. But basically, this is where I landed, right? Value is cards that generate resources for you, and this is distinct from generating agenda points. I don't view agenda points as a resource. They are a goal in the game rather than a resource that you make over the course of the game. So generally, cards that give you value is, the obvious example, something like a hedge fund or a sure gamble, where you turn a card and credits into more credits. Or a diesel, which turns a card and a click into 3 cards. And there's all sorts of cards, that generate value. And a lot of the current standard meta is about fitting in the most possible value you can into your set of cards. One thing I think that I hadn't thought about until I was partway through this video and trying to grapple with what ice is and how to distinguish between value ice and win condition ice, and if that was a real distinction, is that for corporations, one of the things you're doing over the course of the game is changing the cost of the runner to access your cards. You're not often changing their ability to access the cards. Usually runners will be able to, but you're changing the cost that they have to spend to get through those cards. And so some of your ice is generating value, not in that it's helping your board state, but it's hindering your opponent's ability to turn their value into win conditions. And one of the reasons I'm talking about only Corp win conditions is I think runner cards, this distinction between value and win conditions is even a finer and less obvious distinction to make. And this is a general statement, and I know in the current meta, people have some disagreements about this, but typically, scoring agendas reduces the resources you have relative to your opponent's resources. Sometimes you still have a huge lead, or you don't take much of a tempo hit, as is commonly the case in current standard for certain decks, notably Precision Design and Sports Metal. But not every deck works that way, and generally the corporation is spending resources to score an agenda that don't involve creating more economic, more card advantage, or more relative resources. Zach, while I mute my other sources. Okay, so on to sort of my working definition for this video. I don't think it's the definitive definition. I just think it's a one that I'm going to be using to talk about, and I definitely would love to hear feedback on other people's takes on this. But essentially, Netrunner is often played like a Euro game, so instead you accrue value and then convert that value into points. So the working definition for me of a win condition are cards that convert value into points. And like that's sort of a not that useful definition in a lot of ways, but I think it was at least helpful for me to start thinking about things. So the obvious ones, right, are agenda scoring. There's like, you sort of get into that says two categories, right? I can score agendas or I can flatline the runner, because that's how I actually win the game. Having 40 credits doesn't win me the game unless it helps me score agendas or flatline the runner. So in terms of agenda scoring tools, we have lots of stuff. We have ice in some cases. We have fast advance tools are like the clearest case of those cards only function to score points. They don't function otherwise. Ice can do many things. Defensive upgrades almost always are just there to score agendas. But again, there's exceptions to that rule. Flatline tools, basically I put in their own bullet point because stuff like hard-hitting news and boom don't usually generate value for you as the Corp. They're almost exclusively there to enable you to either score agendas or play boom, which I think makes them a little bit different, but closer to something like a true win condition in the sort of the classical sense, where it doesn't generate you any value, but it does win you the game in cases. So this is where my distinction between value being a resource accumulation thing and win condition being a way that you expend those resources to create wins. So now I sort of want to cover how I see the three major decks in the meta, and apologies to all the CTM stands. I know CTM has done well, but I'm going to be talking about Precision Design, Acme, and Sports Metal, and how I view the different cards in those decks serving as win conditions versus value tools versus whatever. So as part of this, I need to lay out the game plan for these decks so that everyone's on the same page, and I'm going to take in the representative deck list. I'm going to try and link all of these in the description below. So this is Rotom Appliance, Chrysium Food, Precision Design list. I took essentially this list to Continentals and to Off the Grid. And the idea behind this list is that it is going to sort of do a rush sort of tempo game plan where it will build a remote with 1 to 2 ice, start scoring behind that, and then over the course of the game, it will score agendas, and as the runner gets tools to handle the remote, it will put new defenses in the form of new ice or new upgrades, and then drag the runner through this remote over and over again. So when I look at this list, right, there's a lot of cards, and there's a lot of value cards in this list. Almost every card in this list is a value card, and almost none of them are like pure win condition cards. So what cards do I sort of identify as the win conditions? So Precision Design win conditions as a whole in the deck, one of the ways it wins is by using gear checks. And so it says Do you have a code gate breaker? Do you have a barrier breaker? In some cases, do you have a sentry breaker? And so stuff like Gatekeeper, Border Control, and Magnet, I think are really interesting examples of ice that almost function solely as win conditions. They are so cheap to get through once the runner has the breaker, or once the Gatekeeper has been rezzed for more than a turn, that they become not liabilities, but they become really trivial hurdles for the runner to get over. And so these ice almost exclusively just function to be powerful in the early game in their ability to force the runner to have the tools to beat these. And then it transitions late game into having Anoetic Void and Managarm Skunkworks to help shore up the remote. So even if the remote is mostly this sort of weaker, flimsier ice, Managarm and Anoetic Void allow Precision Design to force a win that it otherwise can't, or force the runner to be able to deal with these in a unconventional way. And one of the things I discovered, and that really good players already knew, is that actually these two cards are not as essential to winning as Precision Design. You much more can rely on Gatekeepers, Magnets, Border Controls, Hagens, these gear-checking play patterns to deprive the runner of their ability to actually contest your remote continuously and seriously. And one of the things you have is you have 7 assets and a bunch of upgrades that you can all bluff as agendas. And you can bluff them because of seamless launch. And to me, this is like one of the things where I'm maybe going to say something that I think is more likely that people will not agree with. But to me, I don't view seamless launch as a win con necessarily by my definition. It's not. It is serving an important part of the win, and it only really helps to score agendas. So by that definition, it really is a win condition. But to me, one of the things is you can win with drawing no seamless launches in this deck, and it doesn't make it that much harder. The biggest thing is you have to spend a click and a credit to advance. So seamless launch lands in this weird world where it's somewhere between a value card and a win condition card. It's probably closer to a win condition than it is to a value card because it's much more narrow in this Precision Design list, and it opens up a whole range of game plans to the Precision Design lists that force the runner to react in ways that they may not want to. So I guess as I'm talking to myself through this, I'm convincing myself more and more that seamless launch is just a win con card, but it's one of the it's to me somewhat unconventional because it's not actually necessary. I won somewhat handily I have won games in tournaments where I don't draw a seamless launch until I'm ready to score my very last agenda because the deck doesn't rely on it to win. So it's both a win condition and a value card in the list in a way that I think is a little bit interesting and sort of shows why my dichotomy of value cards and win condition cards is not maybe all it's cracked up to be. And now I want to move on to Acme Glacier. And again, sort of the idea here to me is I want to sort of lay out these things, and hopefully something you can take away from this is how you can think about this as the Corp when you're building your deck. You know, how do I turn value cards into wins? How do I put the right amount of win conditions? Because you'll see in Acme, there's not that many cards that serve just to win the game. It's like really 2 cards and then like 2 to 3 ice or like 5 ice in the list. And with Precision Design, it's a pretty similar story where there's 3 critical upgrades and maybe 3 critical ice, 3 to 6 critical ice. And then everything else is trying to generate value and tempo and all these sorts of classic resource game advantages that are transient and just help beat the runner at a specific point in time. So this is Sokka's Destiny-controlled Acme Glacier list, and the basic game plan for this is very different from the Precision Design list in, I think, a fairly fundamental way, where it's just looking to slap a daily quest behind a big piece of ice and stick that for several turns to make the economy for this deck work. Because Data Ward costs 6 credits, Hydra costs 10. Thoth costs, I'm going to not say a number, somewhere between 7 and 9. F2P costs 4. I think it's a 4-5 because it has a self break. Toll Booth is 8. Funhouse is 5. Like there's what is that? 5 ice in this list that cost fewer than 4 credits. That's a lot of money spent on ice, and almost that money doesn't go anywhere else. There's no hard hitting news here. There's nothing of those traditional tools. It's just saying I'm going to res big ice and make the runner be very, very sad. And so it can, if the runner's low on credits, score without the Analytic Void. But if the runner just sits back and gains a lot of credits, the win condition card for this Acme deck, which is on my next slide, is the Analytic Void. I think the interesting difference between these decks is that Precision Design only runs one Analytic Void and often just uses the threat of Analytic Void's existence to win rather than actually installing it or using it in the remote. Usually if Precision Design was using Analytic Void, if it wasn't the very last agenda, it was actually very rough for them to go on and do, or it was one of those games where you often could end up losing because Analytic Void cost Precision Design a lot of resources relative to what the runner was spending to get into the remote in most cases. But Acme plays very differently with a 6 cost to 8 strength Data Ward and a 10 cost 6 strength Hydra. Those ice are so taxing, almost regardless of what breakers the runner is using, that Analytic Void is going to come out ahead for Acme a lot of the time. And so the core win cards are essentially these 2 pieces of ice and Analytic Void. And, Acme will sometimes build up a 2 or 3 ice remote, but often can win with just 1 or 2 ice and an Analytic Void and then start advancing their agendas. But it's a much slower game plan, a more deliberate one than against Precision Design. And so even though it's got, one of the same anchor win conditions, it plays out differently. Then when we move to the final Corp that's in standard at the moment, we're looking at Blame Changer. And the game plan for Blame Changer is essentially score a 3-2 every chance you can. Use your 3 Biotic Labors, use your 3 Audacities, and if you don't have those, draw or gain money depending on if you have 8 credits. And then the ice, unlike the other 2 decks here, isn't serving to win. It can be used to win behind 1 to 2 pieces of ice, and you can gear check the runner just like you would with Precision Design. But you notice it's running Vanillas and Gatekeepers and Magnets and Drafters. It's not running any Ansels or any Brands or any border controls. It's all about, those cards exist just to make the runner find their breaker, and everything else is about scoring out. And this is a really big divergence, and is part of why this deck works well against different runner decks than the previous decks do. The previous 2 decks can have very difficult criminal matchups. This list has a much nicer criminal matchup because it's able to score more frequently and devalue a lot of the criminal's normal game plans. Criminal often relies on being able to deny credits to the Corp, and Sports Metal is able to recover quickly when the runner goes in for the low credit accesses. Sometimes they're giving Sports Metal those credits back. And then in other cases, Sports Metal can score from a single credit, so it can be very difficult to keep the Sports Metal down. And so the win conditions in Sports Metal are pretty straightforward. They're the fast advance tools. Biotic Labor and Audacity are very standard. Jonas's list, the big unit 3000, was on the previous page, and he had, I think, a very fun include of a 1x Bass Churnbog. And these cards are basically only win conditions. Unlike the other ones where sometimes you could put an Analytic Void on the central and have it be right against a counter surveillance Zaya, or, if you see a big dig coming, sometimes you want those defensive upgrades on your remote, or you want the border controls on the central, and I meant central there for the defensive upgrades. Biotic Labor, Audacity, and Bass are really, there's no uses for them other than scoring agendas, and so they really are the closest to me to a true win condition card that don't serve other purposes. And so the value that the deck generates is in GameNet, the value is generated by having the big ice behind with a daily quest ticking. In Precision Design, it's a lot of the value is generated by seamless launch and the tempo positive neutral 4-2s. In Sports Metal, it's the ID and some of the agendas, notably Hyperloop Extension, that generates a lot of value for this corp and is able to propel them through the whole game. So that's sort of where the standard meta, I think, sits at the moment. And, it's a sort of weird to me, almost win condition-less meta, where the two of the top three corps are just relying on ice in some fashion, either really big ice or sort of gear checky rushing ice to score out. And then they have sort of these backup plans of defensive upgrades to sort of get them through the very end of the game. And then you have Sports Metal, which is playing, I guess, proper win conditions by my definition, not the only definition, but by my definition of, these fast advanced tools of Audacity and Biotic Labor and maybe a Bass. But historically, Netrunner has had other win conditions available to it. And so I want to cover a couple of those very quickly because I think they're interesting. And as we think about future metas and past metas and Eternal and fun things like that, it's worth just briefly thinking about. I personally hope these will someday be part of standard again. And so I'm just going to dive into some of these really quickly. So I'm just going to, I'm not going to go through these decks in detail. I think they're really interesting decks. I'm hoping actually at some point to do a series where I talk with players about some of these older decks. But essentially, right, there was combo win conditions. And this is, I think, one of the things that Netrunner has moved away from lately. Because one of the things that people do like about Netrunner is having to build a board. And to some extent, a lot of these, what I'm calling combo win conditions, are decks that are playing all of their cards from hand in a single turn to go and win the game. Both of these decks, this Yellow Railgun deck by Dean and Jaseki's CI7 Reborn list, rely on accelerated diagnostics, which allow them to play 3 operations all at once, ignoring a lot of costs, which is, a huge effect. But there are other sort of combo lists, and there's a lot of them are CI combo lists that don't even need the accelerated diagnostics to win the game. And these decks are winning from a set of cards in hand and generally little to no board state requirements. I think these are kind of cool, but I also understand, they're a divisive topic in the Netrunner community, especially because they ignore so many of the board building aspects that people enjoy about Netrunner. But there is sort of a middle line between these combo win conditions and the sort of, I'm going to call them value check or value engine win conditions that Precision Design and Acme are playing. And that's sort of all of the tag-based win conditions. And so, on one hand, you have tag and bag decks, and I just grabbed Oscillate's Tech Cards Are Bad Argus deck. This one is almost still standard legal, but just isn't quite as good anymore for a variety of reasons that are probably worth a whole video on their own. But right, this was a classic game plan for really old players. This was Sea Scorch, Scorch, Scorch. And the idea is that Argus, in this case, does have to build some board state advantage. Usually it's in the form of having a credit lead and then forcing the runner to run by being at or threatening game point. So Argus was both threatening to score out and then say, if you can't keep up with me in economy, I will flatline you if you try and prevent me from scoring out. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic. Rude Deck is an example of something that's in standard at the moment that does that. But I don't think Rude Deck is that solid in this meta. I don't think it has really any fantastic matchups. CTM when it's been showing up in tournaments lately, has been on kill, but I want to showcase a different type of tag-based win condition as well. So I grabbed TF34's Malia CTM from second at Worlds last year, and this list uses psychographics and market forces to turn tags as a non-binary resource into win conditions. And I think this is an interesting idea. It's not something that I think works well at this exact point in time, but it shows that you don't just have to kill the runner with tags. You can leverage tags in other ways to generate wins. And then we also have almost the other extreme end of board building. So we've gone from, building no board in combo to building basically the same amount of board as something like a precision design, like an Argus list and a precision design end game. Both often end with like 2 to 3 ice on the remote, 1 to 2 ice on HQ, and 0 to 1 ice on R&D. And so they end up looking pretty similar. They just pose challenges on slightly different axes. Precision design is a little more taxing. Argus is a little more credit checking. But then you can also have Lockout Corps, where their goal is to just build out this board state, and then they just say, sorry, runner, you can't win now that I built this board state. Both of these decks use Museum of History, which I should have pulled up on the slide, but I'm just going to let you go and look at yourself. And these decks, the big boys, IG Bioethic Locks and MediaX Corps' Hot Tub Time Machine, are basically built around this idea that your deck, once you have a Museum of History out or several Museum of History outs, you can shuffle back into your deck as many cards as you're drawing a turn, so you're no longer on the clock of getting decked, and so you have no obligation to score any agendas. The Hot Tub Time Machine deck does technically have an agenda scoring plan, but typically both of these decks are looking to kill the runner in some form. The IG deck is looking to just slowly whittle them down with stuff like Bioethics Association, and the Garen Deep Space deck was looking to land some sort of kill. At some point, these decks started picking up SIU, which allowed them to tag the runner if the runner didn't run, and C-Source to tag the runner if the runner did run, or Hard-Hitting News. Either choice is available. And so these corps are, have been pretty aggressively banned in the current SBL, but I think it's certainly open up, and there's a lot of voices in the community that would love to see some of these decks that, like, their real goal is to build this expansive board state, and then once they hit that board state, it becomes very, very difficult to disrupt. And I go back and forth on this. I don't think I personally love the Museum of History gameplay. I don't love the way to win is just make assets impossible, and the only runners that can play are runners that can check assets and handle all of them. But I do think there's a lot of value to recognizing and making these sort of board state achievement win decks have a place in the meta. So I don't remember. Okay, I think that's my last slide. So, this was a bit of a ramble video. I wanted to just start getting stuff out again. I guess the thing I was hoping people would get out of this is when you're thinking about building a deck, you don't need to include that many copies of your win conditions in Netrunner. A lot of Netrunner is about building this sort of value engine on the board, and then you need just a little bit of spice to make your Corp card get over the top. So when we look back at Sports Metal, right, they're running 6 cards that are, their win conditions. 3 Audacities, 3 Biotic Laborers, and maybe a Bass, so we could call that 7 cards. And then almost every other card is generating value for them in some way. And for Acme, it's really the 2 Anoetic Voids, and then to some extent the ID, and then every other card is some balance of value and win condition. The Ice is sort of, in Acme, is balancing that line between it's generating them a lot of value by making accesses very expensive for the runner, and eventually, that expense gets converted into making a win condition because the runner can't afford to run, a Data Ward Hydra remote, paying 7 credits and easily 10, 5, 10, 12 credits to break a Hydra. Like, no runner can spend 19 credits 4 times in a turn to steal a Bologna and then do that 3 times in a game, which they would need to do to steal all the agendas they would need to win. So there's just that's sort of the Acme win condition is I'm just going to get 2 big beefy ice, and then I'm going to use Anoetic Void to keep dragging you over. And then Precision Design, the ice, it's stuff like the 2 border controls, the 3 gatekeepers are sort of classically part of the win conditions, as are the magnets. And then you have the 1 Animatic Void and the 2 Mana Garm Skunkworks. So you're at, again, 6 to 7 cards that's primary purpose is to help you score agendas, and everything else is about generating value, getting card credit, and making access for the runner less valuable, either by shuffling away agendas or making those central accesses more expensive. And as the runner, when you're thinking about sitting down against these corps, one of the things you should be thinking about is, how is the Corp playing to win? How do I disrupt that? And how do I not fall behind? So that's going to wrap it up for me. I hope everyone enjoyed this video. And I do hope to be returning to my schedule shortly. I don't think I'll be doing reviews of my Continental stuff, just because it turns out I waited too long and now JNet has changed and I don't think the replays are backwards compatible anymore. If people really want that, I can try and bug some people to get that figured out. But I figure I'm going to try and start doing some other stuff and hopefully have more word on that soon. Thank you, everyone, and please remember to like and subscribe.